Long before you speak, act, or even reveal your name, your reputation has already declared who you are. To Machiavelli, this wasn't a consequence of influence. It was influence. A man's reputation moves ahead of him like a shadow, shifting the energy in any space it enters. People adjust, they become cautious, defensive, judgmental, obedient, all before you utter a single word. Those with power understand this. But those who are truly feared, they turn it into a weapon. They don't just cultivate a name, they construct legend. So intense, so unforgettable, that people don't merely respect them, they revere them. And reverence is power's final form. Not obedience out of instruction, but obedience born from belief. Belief that you are more than just human. You are a symbol, a myth, a force they dread defying, even in your absence. Machiavelli studied this relentlessly. In a world where supposed allies were deceptive and enemies wore smiles, reputation was both his shield and his sharpest edge. He didn't learn this from philosophy texts, but through betrayal, through banishment, through observing weaker men rise by illusion, not integrity. So he reframed the question, how do you create a reputation so formidable, so magnetic, so deeply feared, that submission feels like faith? What he discovered wasn't kindness or honesty, but something far more precise. Strategic, psychological manipulation. It begins with mystery. Many assume that a solid reputation is earned by being seen, speaking loudly, and proving oneself constantly. But that's the mark of someone desperate for acknowledgement. Machiavelli believed quite the opposite. If you must choose, it's better to be feared than adored. Yet fear only emerges through uncertainty. People are unnerved by what they cannot predict, and mystery is the foundation where myth begins. You never show all your cards, you imply your strength. Let whispers amplify your deeds. Deliver one master stroke, precise, elegant, unforgettable, and then retreat. That void becomes influence. That silence rings louder than endless noise. It's why history's most admired figures were usually the quietest. When they finally spoke, people listened not for volume, but because their energy made every word feel divine. But mystery alone is insufficient. The second layer is selective punishment, not physical, but psychological and social. Machiavelli warned that a leader who punishes too often weakens his grip, but the one who strikes rarely and with icy precision commands lasting dread. When disrespected, don't react with emotion. Don't argue, don't justify. Simply erase them from your sphere overtly or discreetly. Do it with such poise that onlookers hesitate to ever cross that line. The message becomes clear. Your standards are non-negotiable. And your silence is a far deadlier force than confrontation. This begins a ripple effect, not just signaling that you're formidable, but that your standards are beyond reproach. Disrespect doesn't earn a reaction, it earns erasure. And that's when the myth begins to form. Because people no longer just witness your actions, they start to wonder what else you might be capable of. And when curiosity turns to uncertainty, myth-making begins. This is how reputations ascend to sacred status. They stop relying on truth and start expanding through fear, assumption, and awe. Then comes the third element, strategic generosity. You don't distribute validation freely. You make it scarce, intentional, meaningful. The moment you acknowledge someone, it becomes a rare reward. They'll chase that feeling again. They'll speak of it. Others will envy it. And just like that, your words are no longer mere statements, they've become value, currency. This is how Machiavelli would inspire devotion, not by demanding loyalty, but by making his presence, his approval, even his silence feel exalted. When that illusion is reinforced through mystique, calculated precision, and rare favor, you cease being just a man. You become an icon. And icons don't explain, they endure. Eventually, you stop steering your reputation, and your reputation starts steering them. That's the hidden technique Machiavelli mastered. A powerful image doesn't need constant protection, it becomes self-sustaining. Once the myth is rooted, Even your detractors begin altering their behavior around it. They pause before speaking your name. They hesitate before challenging you, not out of fear of what has happened, but what might happen. That's when fear mutates into expectation, and expectation, in time, transforms into reverence. But achieving that tier requires intent. Your image can't be left to randomness. It must be orchestrated down to every detail. What follows next? Symbolic alignment. Every revered leader, feared or adored, is remembered by a set of consistent, powerful symbols. A certain tone, a distinct appearance, a poised stance, a recurring phrase, a personal ritual. These aren't mere stylistic choices. They're anchors, mental cues that allow others to label you, retell your story, keep you in memory. Machiavelli would never blend into the crowd. He wouldn't walk, speak, or even show up like anyone else. Because conformity erodes mystique. Conformity makes you forgettable. You want to be unmistakable. You step into a space and the atmosphere shifts, not because you're boisterous, but because your presence disrupts the emotional frequency. People feel something they can't describe. That's how monarchs move. That's how divinity is imagined. But here's the genius. The more they speak of your aura, the less you ever need to justify yourself. You've conditioned them to find significance in your stillness, to attach meaning to your pauses, to discover depth in your distance. This isn't vanity, it's architecture. Because while others scramble for recognition, you're executing what Machiavelli prized most: transforming perception into influence. Once you've established this kind of presence, the next evolution is influence by proxy, and this is where the game turns high stakes. Machiavelli recognized that the strongest reputations aren't built by the individual alone, but through the voices that surround him. He referred to it as dominance through fear and allegiance. You consciously empower those who carry your legend forward, not just companions, but devotees. People who repeat your sayings, reflect your ethos, and guard your legacy as if it were their own. You reward them not with applause, but with access, favor, and closeness. You don't say, "Thank you for standing by me." You give them gifts, openings, and privilege. Soon your name gains gravity, not because you attend every discussion, but because your myth does. People start referencing you in conversations you were never present for. They begin to self-check. Would he approve of this? Should I say this out loud? What if she hears about this? Is this up to their standard? This is how rulers command without shouting, how ideologues shape society long after they're gone. When your words, deeds, and presence continue to echo in your absence, that's no longer mere influence. That's the beginning of worship. But there's one final metric of a legendary reputation. It's not about whether people follow when you're ascending. It's about whether they fear betraying you when you're completely out of sight. That's the line between admiration and reverence. Admiration is soft, it's fleeting, it's conditional. But reverence, real, visceral, irrational reverence, becomes psychological captivity. It keeps people loyal to an image they hold of you in their heads. And Machiavelli would pose the question, what have you done to implant that image? There comes a shift when power requires no effort, when your influence enters before you do. And people begin operating under your terms without even knowing it. That moment isn't stumbled into, it's engineered, refined, preserved. And Machiavelli knew the key to activate it. The fear of your disapproval. Not penalties, not confrontation, but silent disapproval. Because once people begin to prize how you view them more than how they see themselves, you own their minds. They're no longer scared of making a mistake. They're scared of how you'll perceive it. They adjust, not to win favor, but to protect the version of themselves that exists in your gaze. That's when your reputation becomes a mirror they're afraid to look away from. So, how do you construct that kind of gravitational pull? By mastering a forgotten art. The restrained response. Most reveal their emotions too fast. They applaud too eagerly, critique too impulsively. They wear their feelings on display. But Machiavelli wouldn't. He'd watch, analyze, absorb, and remain silent, that silence would echo louder than any insult. Because silence from someone whose name commands attention feels like a sentence. A single cold glance from someone you look up to can strike deeper than 1,000 criticisms. He became an expert in the art of postponed reaction. When someone anticipated praise, he'd offer a faint nod and say, "Time will tell." When others feared he'd lash out, he'd offer a calm smile and reply, "Duly noted." And when someone failed him, he wouldn't criticize, he would simply step away. That quiet detachment? That became its own form of power. It taught those around him that his attention wasn't cheap, that his perspective wasn't handed out freely, it had to be earned. And once that level of standard is felt, your image begins to ascend into legend. Because now people aren't just recounting what you did, they're analyzing your silences, your looks, the subtle pause before you speak. That is the kind of power emperors crave, not just control over actions, but influence over thoughts. But Machiavelli didn't stop at restraint. He pushed further with one of his harshest doctrines. Guard your myth more fiercely than your relationships. If anyone even slightly threatened the perception you've built, if they casually dropped your name, made jokes about you, or suggested too much familiarity, you eliminated them quickly, quietly, completely. Why? Because once people believe they have casual access to your identity, they begin to erode your aura. They whisper, "He's not really that serious," or "She's not what people think." And just like that, the foundation of your legend begins to splinter. Machiavelli saw this happen to rulers again and again. They allowed closeness, sought popularity, permitted too much intimacy, and eventually, their power began to decay from within. So he established a rule: allow admiration, accept respect, but never grant parody. Which leads to one of the most misunderstood elements of influence: distance. Reverence cannot survive without separation. If you're constantly around, always reachable, endlessly visible, you become ordinary. And what is overly familiar loses its mystique. So you withdraw not to hide, but to apply pressure. You make yourself scarce. You reappear only when the impact will be undeniable. You say no often, not to be arrogant, but to preserve value. And what follows? Your rarity becomes revered. They discuss you more in your absence. They speculate more when you stay silent. They obsess over your thoughts because yours now hold more weight than anyone else's. That isn't coincidence, that's calculated design. And Machiavelli would state it plainly: the man who becomes rare becomes invaluable. Because when power reaches its pinnacle, you are no longer merely a human. You are presence, essence, symbolism. And that is where devotion begins. You'll know you've truly made it not when people agree with you, but when they quote you. Not because they remember the exact phrase, but because your words now stand for something greater than the moment they were said. That's when your reputation evolves from identity to ideology. Machiavelli knew this deeply. He witnessed how Caesar's name endured beyond the blade, how Alexander's legend outlived the borders of his empire. A well-designed reputation, he realized, could achieve immortality, even if its originator did not. And that path wasn't laid with charm, kindness, or popularity. It was forged through total narrative control. Because real power doesn't come from belief alone. It comes from shaping belief. So how do you make sure your story remains intact, even when you're not there to defend it? You don't gather followers, you cultivate disciples. Where ordinary men seek allies, Machiavelli would gather amplifiers, individuals who thrive by broadcasting his message, who rise by keeping his name polished, who tie their ascent to the strength of his myth. This is how your reputation starts growing without effort. They spread your image not out of loyalty, but out of self-interest. And when someone challenges your authority, these disciples defend it not because you ask, but because their own power depends on yours. That's the birth of the cult of personality. Not by force, but through mutual dependence. You want others to rely on the strength of your image for validation, for status, for identity. And when that happens, Any attack on you becomes an attack on a collective belief system. You're no longer a single figure, you're an institution. But there's one final tier, and it's not for the cautious. It's when you deliberately introduce contradiction into your myth. Why? Because the most potent reputations are never one-dimensional. They're mysterious. People should never be entirely sure of your motives, your boundaries, your beliefs. They should hear rumors that don't align, that one day you showed ruthless control and the next unexpected mercy, that you humiliated a traitor, yet forgave a liar. This confusion is intentional because confusion inspires curiosity. And curiosity is more powerful than mere admiration. When people can't categorize you, they stop judging and start analyzing. And once they're analyzing, they can't dismiss you. They're invested in understanding you. Machiavelli would put it simply, if your reputation can be explained, it can be dismantled. But if it confuses, it dominates. That confusion becomes your cloak of mist. No one dares walk through without fear. And within that mist, you perform your most unsettling move. You evolve. While others cling to static identities, you transform. You become sharper, more unpredictable, or perhaps more gracious, but only toward those who've earned it. Your myth shifts, your aura recalibrates. And suddenly, even those who once thought they knew you feel unsettled, and their reverence deepens, not from affection but from uncertainty, because they no longer understand you well enough not to admire you. That's how you build a reputation that isn't merely respected, it's feared, echoed, and believed without needing validation. Machiavelli never asked to be understood. He knew power doesn't stem from clarity, it comes from being interpreted in 1,000 ways, all of them advantageous to you. When people fail to explain you, when they hesitate, unsure if you're ruthless or kind, calculated or benevolent, they start injecting their own fears and fantasies into your myth. You stop being a person, you become a mirror, a reflection of their doubt, a presence that makes them wonder, have I earned their attention? What do they see when they look at me? That's what it means to forge a legend near divine status. Not as a god of grace, but as a deity of enigma. And to ascend to that plane, Machiavelli's final rule is absolute. Become the benchmark by which others measure themselves. This doesn't require obvious superiority. It requires untouchable subtlety. You move differently. You respond deliberately. You don't laugh when everyone else does. You're not afraid of silence. And when you finally speak, your words carry undeniable weight. You're not the loudest voice in the room. You silence the room simply by entering. People don't just admire you. They adjust in your presence. Their posture stiffens. Their words sharpen. Their mask drops just enough to show discomfort. And that discomfort becomes the foundation of your myth. Machiavelli never advocated for accessibility. He stood for aspiration. You don't offer comfort, you inspire people to elevate themselves. Even if they resent you for it. Even if they gossip, because gossip means they're still watching, still obsessed, still feeding your legend. But let's be brutally clear, none of this works if you chase it. You can't demand reverence. But what you can do, what Machiavelli demanded, was mastery over yourself so absolute that others lose control around you. That's the final measure. No reaction to insults, no exaggerated pride in praise, no gossip, no defenses, just composure, because when chaos surrounds you, stillness becomes sacred. And now the transformation is complete. You no longer shape your reputation, it shapes you. It speaks in your absence. It defends you in rooms you've never entered. It earns loyalty from people you've never met. And it crafts an atmosphere so dense that people don't merely respect you. They revere the silence tied to your name. This is what Machiavelli would call the final evolution of power. Not the sword, not the crown, not the throne, but an unseen empire. An empire made of belief, a truth he lived by, though he never spoke aloud. The man with the most formidable reputation shapes the future even after he's gone. Because long after your hands leave the chessboard, your name still moves the pieces. It echoes in boardrooms, haunts discussions, resides in the minds of those who've never met you but fear what you were capable of. That is the ultimate legacy test. Do people still alter their behavior based on who you once were? If the answer is yes, you haven't just built a reputation, you've constructed a belief system around your identity. But here's the quiet secret few understand. Such a legacy is not forged in spectacle. It's born in precision, in how you hold silence before speaking, in your calm when others unravel, in your ability to expose others without ever revealing yourself, in the way your exit changes the mood of a room. You can't fake this. You can't fast-track it. Because while people may follow a facade, they only worship the real standard. And through your choices, your restraint, your aura, you've become that standard. So what now? You let the myth breathe. You don't chase credit. You don't correct the noise. You don't seek validation. You let your legend walk on its own. Let others argue about your intentions. Fear your next move even if that move never comes. That's how Machiavelli would anchor his legacy. Not with cheers, but with inevitability. Because true reverence doesn't come from loud moments, it comes from weight, from moving so precisely, so purposefully, that even your silence leaves a mark. From living in a way that makes others feel small, not because you diminish them, but because they recognize they'll never match you, and they don't resent you for it. They kneel, not in weakness, but in awe. So here's your last lesson. Don't craft a name for applause. Craft one for permanence. Because one day, when rooms fall quiet at your arrival, when your adversaries soften their voice at the mention of your name, when strangers speak of you as an idea rather than a man, you'll know you've succeeded. You didn't just rise, you became irreversible. You became a figure revered. That is the Machiavellian art.